Indigenous peoples and settlers. The human history of Canada began when people crossed the Bering Strait from Asia more than 10,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, Canada was populated by various Indigenous communities, each with their own languages and governing systems. This is a map of Canada as it stood at the point of European settlement starting in the 1600s. The first French settlement in Acadia was built in 1604. The English at the point opted to settle further south along the Atlantic coast of what's now the US. By the end of the 1600s, the Hudson's Bay Company began trading. There aren't many accounts of the establishment of the Hudson's Bay Company that hasn't been written by the Bay Company itself. The following is from a CBC podcast called The Secret Life of Canada, written in part by First Nations Voices.
How did a company that's so old become so linked to the foundations and the identity of Canada?
Okay, so the beginning of all of this was in 1610. A man by the name of Henry Hudson set sail from London with a crew of 22 people, including his son John. They entered what is now called the Hudson Strait. Obviously, it wasn't when they entered it, but just south of Baffin Island, and then sailed into Hudson's Bay, which they thought was the Pacific Ocean. By the winter, the conditions became terrible, and everyone almost froze to death or got scurvy. The men ended up eating frogs and moss and hating Captain Hudson. It got so bad that the crew threw Henry, his son, and some faithful crew members into a small boat and pushed them out onto the water. Bad. But by the 1650s, two French traders named Chouart and Des Grossiers noticed that the water of the Hudson's Bay would be a faster and safer sea passage. The Wendat, the indigenous people of that region, had shown them an area that had a massive amount of beaver and other animals just dying to get turned into hats and coats. So they decided the Hudson's Bay would be a great area to claim as a trading post.
Despite the fact that at that time there were thousands of indigenous people already trading with each other.
Yeah, I mean, a ton of people were living life and doing fine when Chouart and Des Grossiers said, you know what this place needs? Us.
So they decided that in order to really make a go of building a trading company, they needed to head back to France and get their countrymen's support for this venture. So they asked France, and France said,
not only is it a hard pass, but we're gonna fine you. Take all your fur. It's nice, by the way. And you, Des Grossiers, you're going to jail for having left without permission.
And that had to burn.
Oh, yeah. So in retaliation, they did the one thing that would enrage France the most.
They went to England.
Exactly. You got it. And they asked Prince Rupert, who was the cousin of King Charles II, for help. He said yes, of course, because what could be better than scooping the French? So England sends them back. They touch down in 1668 in a waterway between today's Ontario and Quebec called Winnipesaukee. After they arrived, they quickly renamed it James Bay. This voyage and these men are recognized as the founding elements of the Hudson's Bay Company. So when they landed, England gave them the ability to trade basically wherever they wanted, as long as the territory traversed into the Hudson's Bay. This territory was named Rupert's Land after Prince Rupert.
Makes sense. The territory that they claimed was enormous and 15 times the size of Britain, almost 40% of what we call Canada today. To give you an idea of how big that is, today's Rupert's Land would be Manitoba, most of Saskatchewan, southern Alberta, southern Nunavut, parts of northern Ontario and Quebec, and some of the U.S. And again, this was already the territory of several First Nations and thousands of people.
The Hudson's Bay Charter was granted in 1670. Now, it contained a clause that the Hudson's Bay Company was not allowed to attack the holdings of any other Christian monarchs. So if anybody else who was Christian, like the French or the, Dutch, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, they were.
Got there,
they were
no
in there.
attacks. But it said almost nothing about the rights and holdings of the nations who had been living on the land for
Charter.
Yeah.
So it gave the Hudson's Bay Company the right to exploit mineral resources, which would become incredibly important because by 1960, they had become the sixth largest Canadian oil producer.
I mean, it's kind of stunning because you realize it's way more than the department store you go to buy a tuna fish sandwich from while also looking for leggings.
All right. The charter also included the obligation to search for the Northwest Passage, which everyone was obsessed with at that time. You can hear a little bit about that in our North episode from season 1. So it was this territory that the Hudson's Bay Company would have a monopoly over for the next 200 years. All of that aside, the Hudson's Bay beginnings are aligned with an industry that drastically altered Indigenous life, traditions, and wildlife in this country. In Europe, the demand for beaver went through the roof because the fur was waterproof and because there was a fashion craze. Hats.
Yeah. There were estimated approximately 6 million beavers at the beginning of the fur trade. By the late 19th century, the beaver was close to extinction. It's why they are the symbol of Canada. It was their fur in a way that started the economy.
I'm sure beavers find a lot of comfort in that fact.
I know.
Indigenous people and settlers, the Constitution Act and the New Settlers. The Constitution Act was signed, dividing the French and English populations into, respectively, Lower Canada, which would become Quebec, and Upper Canada, which would become Ontario. Each had its own assembly. Directly after this, Canada experienced a surge in settlement. It is estimated in the first half of the 1800s that over 800,000 people immigrated from the British Isles. The Irish potato famine alone drove 250,000 Irish to Canada. The Irish potato famine, also known as the Great Hunger, began in 1845 when a fungus-like organism ruined up to 1/2 of the potato crop that year, and about 3/4 of the crop over the next 7 years. The tenant farmers of Ireland, then ruled as a colony of Great Britain, relied heavily on the potato as a source of food. So the infestation had a catastrophic impact on Ireland and its population. Before it ended in 1852, roughly 1 million Irish died from starvation and related causes, with at least another million forced to leave their homeland as refugees. Ireland's population fell by 25%.
So the most famous phase of Irish migration to North America generally was the Great Irish Famine, the potato famine from 1845 to 1851. But really, in terms of British North American migration, it really is the last short phase of Irish migration to British North America. So 1846, about 30,000 Irish migrated, mostly Roman Catholic. In 1847, or Black 47, when there had been repeated crop failures in 45 and 46, we saw over 100,000 Irish leave either British ports or Irish ports headed for British North America. Now, the bulk of that migration came to Quebec. So somewhere around 90,000 Irish were funneled through the quarantine station at Grosse Ile and about 17,000 went through Partridge Island quarantine station outside of St. John, New Brunswick. A handful of ships, maybe 5, went to Halifax, 2 to Newfoundland, 1 to Prince Edward Island. Those colonies were not affected greatly. It was New Brunswick where the Irish landed, and many of them moved on to what they call the Boston States, that is New England, that felt some immediate impact of poor people arriving on their shore in dreadful conditions. But the worst was felt at Quebec. When you understand that the trip across the Atlantic in 1847 was by sail, in ships that had been previously used for regular cargo, whether it be timber or grain, this was human ballast. People were boarded ships at Limerick, at Cork, Dublin, Liverpool, where the bulk came from. And these people essentially replaced the rocks that would be used as ballast as these empty ships would go back across the Atlantic. The trip could take up to 6 weeks, sometimes 8, if the winds were against you, which they normally were. And of course, the Atlantic currents are flowing in the opposite direction. And then, of course, if you were weak and suffering when you got on board because of the various diseases related to malnutrition, then on board ship in close confines with over 300 or 400 people crammed below decks in bunks 3 high and probably 3 persons deep, disease carries. And typhus was the principal killer, or ship's fever. It's a rickettsia bacteria that is in the feces of lice. The lice essentially lay their feces on your arm. You get itchy because they've bitten you at the same time, and you effectively infect yourself. And so the rickettsia bacteria gets into the open cut, and for about a week it remains dormant, and then you get essentially all of the visible symptoms, the sense of dizziness and fogginess, ergo the name typhus. Some internal damage is done, oftentimes blistering and rashes on the skin, and there was no treatment. I mean, in those days, we have antibiotics. They didn't. They used wine, they used poultices, they used milk, but about 50% of the people who contract typhus die. And so we have horrendous tales. A ship, for example, called the Virginius, which sailed from Liverpool containing all of the assisted immigrants from Dennis Mann's estate in Roscommon. Close to 40% of the people on board that ship died or were infected with typhus and later died either at Gros Isle, the quarantine station, or later on because their symptoms weren't detected when they went through quarantine. And that was the danger. So, for example, 1,490 people emigrated from Mann's estate at Strokestown in 1847. And we calculate now that probably only 70% survived the first part of their journey to British North America. So what we have are Irish, both Catholic now in the majority and Protestants in the minority, coming to British North America in 1847. After the horrendous year, the shipping rates to British North America go up, the shipping standards change, and now it becomes cheaper to go to the United States. And that's why the famine migration is short, it's intensive, and it essentially dissipates by 1850. But what it does is that it now provides new Irish migrants to the Canadas who actually seek out communities of Irish who have already been there, or simply move on through Montreal or Niagara to the United States. But it is a tragedy. I'll give you the story of the Willis family. Irish Protestant family, likely from Tipperary. There were 7 of them in 1847. They board a ship at Limerick, but the youngest child is detected as having the early signs of typhus by medical authorities at the dock, and the parents have to leave him behind, which means mother, father, and 4 Willis children get on board ship to sail for Quebec. By the time the voyage reaches Gros Isle, 2 of the children have already died. There are 4 out of the 7 left. Another dies at Gros Isle. There are now 3 out of the 7 left. By the time Mr. and Mrs. Willis and 1 child reach Toronto, Mr. Willis and the son have been infected by typhus. And by the time we find out the story, only Mary Willis is left living in Brantford, the sole survivor of this Protestant Irish family who migrated during the famine. Is this a typical story? No, but it is symptomatic of a lot of the suffering that was experienced by those refugees from Ireland in 1847. And it's no wonder that when you hear stories like this, that the Irish experience then is seen through the lenses of the famine. And what is completely ignored is the fact that 450,000 Irish were already migrants to British North America before 1845.
The flow of Irish immigrants arrived, some stopping in Gros-Isle Island outside of Quebec City to quarantine. It's estimated that 89,738 people landed there, of which around 75,000 were Irish. They were later forwarded to Montreal, where they ended up in quarantine sheds in Point St. Charles on Windmill Point, now what's known as Victoria Bridge. At this point, it was just 10 years after Louis Papineau led a failed rebellion to free Lower Canada from the British colonial authorities. The Anglophone minority population continued to assert its power against the French-Canadian majority in the city, so the arrival of additional Anglophones heightened sectarian tensions. As we saw, they also brought typhus with them, which terrified the population of Montreal. At the time, the Montreal Board of Health considered relocating the migrants to a quarantine site in Boucherville. In the end, the decision did not receive the endorsement of Mayor John Mills and the city commissioners. The sick were tended by the Grey Nuns and other volunteers, including Mayor Mills himself, who caught the disease and died. In the end, many Quebecers came forward to adopt the hundreds of children who survived. The Black Rock was erected in Point St. Charles under the Victoria Bridge in 1859. It is the headstone for a mass grave of around 6,000 Irish immigrants who died in the voyage or on arrival to Montreal from Ireland. It's worth noting that although we call Les Sœurs Grises the Grey Nuns, that wasn't what the nickname meant. Les Sœurs Grises referred to the drunk sisters. Some say because their outfits were ugly, others say because the founder, Marguerite Diouville, her husband was a bootlegger, and yet others believe that they were given the name because many in Montreal didn't understand their devotion to the most vulnerable members of society. By 1872, 300 years after Canada's first European colonial settlement, Canada's first census indicated that the total population of Canada was 3.7 million, and it listed 36 First Nations tribes with a total population of only 102,358. No one knows how accurate this report is, but in other words, by now, the First Nations peoples accounted for only 2.7% of Canada's population. Today, the proportion of Canada's first Indigenous population relative to the population of Canada stands at twice that number. We'll examine what happened in more detail later on in the course. To further encourage settlement, the Dominion Lands Act of 1872 granted free land to people from the UK, the US, and Scandinavia. The Canadian Pacific Railway, completed in 1885, facilitated the transport of settlers to the west. The Métis were paid to leave their lands, and reserves were set up from 1871 to 1921 to contain what remained of the First Nations populations. This will be discussed later on in the course. More than 15,000 Chinese came over in the early 1880s to build the most dangerous and difficult section of the Canadian Pacific Railway.
What we do know is that the next time we have a substantial number of Chinese people beginning to settle was in the 1850s.
So why were they coming here?
Well, some of this has to do with the tumultuous conditions that were happening in China at the time. Many Chinese people who came over were from the southern port of Guangzhou. Between 1780 and 1850, the population in that region leapt from 16 million to 28 million.
Wow.
The strain on the economy, rent prices for land skyrocketed, and people couldn't plant enough crops to feed themselves and their families. Also, there was weather events like floods and droughts that really exacerbated the situation.
Right. So all of these things, I mean,
Yes.
it makes sense that you're going to try and find a better life somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And this wasn't even the half of it. There was lots of conflict as well going on at the time. And a lot of them were trade-based. Great Britain was super into Chinese goods in the 1800s, including things like porcelain and silk and tea. All right. So what we had here was that, there was a trade issue between China and Britain. Britain really wanted to address this. And so what they decided to do was grow some poppies in India.
So how did that help?
So opium comes from poppies.
Right.
So the thinking was if the East India Company could get people in China addicted to opium, then that would help open the trade doors to China. We've got the opium that you're now addicted to. Give us the tea.
Wow.
First Opium War was from 1839 to 1842, and about 10 years later there was a second Opium War where the French joined in. And then there was the Taiping Rebellion, a religious conflict that lasted 15 years and claimed an estimated 20 to 30 million lives. There were also multiple peasant uprisings during this time that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives.
That is a lot of overlapping fighting. So China is a whole world of strife. And so, of course, people wanted to get out of Dodge at this time.
Yeah, exactly. So the first real pull to the Americas came in 1848 when gold was found in the Sacramento Valley. Then in 1857, gold was found in the Fraser Valley, and the rush was on. Chinese gold seekers came from San Francisco because some had already been there from the previous gold rush, and then they came direct from Hong Kong to Victoria.
So
this is when we really start to see the beginning of Chinatown in Victoria. In 1858, much of Victoria had already been claimed in one way or another by groups of people.
in reality, it had been the territory of many Indigenous people.
Yeah, and now non-Indigenous people began to claim the land for themselves. Englishmen who were lawyers or doctors had settled into the hillsides of the city. The Hudson's Bay Company men who worked in trade settled on Humboldt Street, and Jewish merchants settled on Johnson Street. These white landlords would not rent, lease, or sell their lands to Chinese people unless they were on the fringes of town in undesirable areas. Mm-hmm. These places were called pig pens by people who stayed in them because they were so cramped and prison-like. Sometimes in places like Vancouver, newly landed Chinese people were quarantined to these spaces.
Wow.
In Victoria, the Chinese set up on the north bank to the rest of the city, and there was room for Chinatown to expand northwards towards Cormorant Street. Shacks and tents were the first structures Chinese people set up. Initially, it was a stopping place for miners to rest, to shop for goods they needed for the journey to the gold fields.
Many Chinatowns in BC were started in much the same way as in Victoria, with a single street which, when translated, meant Chinese Street.
By 1862, the population of Chinatown in Victoria would have been about 300 people. There were many temporary residents in the early days, as many people were heading off to seek gold or coming back from laboring work. Sometimes the population of the settlement would swell when a ship came in from Hong Kong and then decrease as people headed out for work.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. The area grew from being called Chinese Street to Chinese Port, and then finally to Chinatown. Once the gold rush was over, work really dried up. This was a time when people began fighting for jobs, and many Chinese men were willing to work longer hours for lower wages.
And I can't imagine that this was well received by all the white people.
No, it was not. And things were only going to get worse. In 1871, British Columbia joined Confederation. One of the key reasons BC joined was the promise of a railway that would connect the country.
Sea to shining sea.
That's right. This would be a difficult undertaking because this new railway would have to go through the Rocky Mountains.
Right. And we know that many Chinese people were employed to build it because they were paid less. Chinese men began to work on the railway. They were not only underpaid, they were denied medical attention when they were sick. They were overcharged for supplies, and they suffered from malnutrition.
That reminds me of that Canadian Heritage Minute.
All right, who wants to earn some danger pay? All you have to do is go down in the tunnel with the nitro and set the charge.
Okay, I do really good. You see.
Now pour it in the hole gently, understand? Any little bump and that stuff will blow.
Damn, that's the third one we lost this month.
I lost many friends. They say there is one dead Chinese man for every mile of that track. That one.
2,000 people died, according to some estimates.
Because of Chinese labor on the railroad, it is said that Canada saved between $3 and $5 million.
Which is massive because even though that's a massive number now, think about it
Then.
That's, wow.
After the railroad was completed, many Chinese, and this is where we start to see some of the most profound racism happening.
Right. So the need for Chinatowns was much more urgent.
Yes.
You want community around you.
In 1872, British Columbia passed an act to disenfranchise, which means to take the rights away, of Chinese people and Indigenous people. And this is something that we're going to take a look at a little bit deeper in our next episode.
Right.
Just over a decade later, the Canadian government passed the Chinese Immigration Act, which meant a head tax of $50 would be charged to any Chinese person coming to the country. This was obviously put into place to deter them, but the conditions in China were still so bad that people could make more money here.
Well, I was going to say it sounds like the opposite of an immigration act. It's like the anti-immigration act.
Yes.
In 1901, the tax was then doubled to $100, which was a huge amount of money. And then in 1903, it was raised again to $500, which would have been and thousands of dollars in today's money.